I'm really delighted to be here today. I grew up here and have family here. And by here, in that case, I mean at IUSB. So it's a special honor to get to talk about my research and my trajectory today. But it's also really special to get to talk to a group of young scholars interested in gender studies and women's issues. And my purpose is to share with you my own development as a scholar studying gender and power, to share some of my research findings, and to offer some, I don't know if I'd want to call it advice, but some ideas about how you might think about your own development of your intellectual interests. So I've titled the talk The Romance of Race, or The Romance of Research, for a couple of reasons. So first, it echoes the title of my book, The Romance of Race. So, and here's the cover, and copies are on sale. And as Katie talked about, it deals with women writers' exploration of race, gender, and romantic conventions in literature and popular culture. And I will talk more about the research in the book. But I want to highlight that in calling it the romance of research, I want to explore the metaphor of intellectual labor as a form of love, of cultivating an affective relationship with your scholarship. And in whether it ends up being a fling with a particular research topic or developing into a long-term relationship, I think it's worth thinking about those kinds of emotional ties to the work that we do. So, in this way, when I'm talking about the romance of research, I'm emphasizing the connection between work and play, between labor and leisure, effort and pleasure. I want to exhort you to think of research as both fun and meaningful. At its best, research is a process that emerges out of passion for knowledge, a fascination with a subject, and the desire to really understand the larger issues that a particular text or data set allows you to explore. Developing a rich research topic can be a bit like falling in love. It can take over your thoughts, grab hold of you, wake you up in the middle of the night, prevent you from falling asleep, and not easily let you go. And like romance, research requires give and take. You have to put in the work, but it also can be deeply rewarding. You do the work to research, to write, to revise, re-revise again, and rethink your conclusions. But when it is going well, it fuels itself with further questions you want answered, and it spurs you on with new ideas. The seeds of my own research were planted a long time ago. I credit the beginning with in 1996, when I was a sophomore in college at Northwestern University, and I took a class on 19th century women writers with Professor Julia Stern. In addition to reading adventure tales and sentimental fiction, things I'd never read before, one of our texts was Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, which many of you may have read, from 1869, and that had been a childhood favorite of mine. But what shocked me upon re-encountering the text many years later was its deep anxiety about immigrants, and particularly German and Irish immigrants, who appeared as pathetic wretches or invading hordes. And I kept asking myself, how had I not noticed that before? I was disturbed by this ugly feature of a beloved childhood text, and I wanted to understand the larger social world in which Alcott's fiction circulated. For example, why were German and Irish immigrants frequently described in non-human terms, as animals or insects? Why were Germans perceived to be relatively better than the Irish immigrants in the story? And what qualities made the German Professor Baer acceptable as a romantic partner for the heroine Jo? I returned to those questions when I wrote a senior honors thesis on the historical and cultural conditions that shaped Alcott's xenophobia, and thus began a long intellectual journey to think about the complicated ways that race, class, and gender are connected and expressed in popular culture text, particularly those written predominantly by and for women. As Anne McClintock explains, these categories, race, class, and gender, are not distinct realms of experience, existing in splendid isolation from each other, nor can they simply be yoked together retrospectively. Rather, they come into existence in and through relation to each other, if in contradictory and conflictual ways. That senior thesis on Alcott, which introduced me to cultural studies as a critical approach, was the first milestone towards articulating my ideas about the role of popular literature to both reflect and shape public opinion about a range of contemporary issues: gender roles for men and women, shifting attitudes towards immigrants and minorities, class tensions and community alliances. Discovering the contradictions and complexities surrounding women and immigrants fueled my curiosity about the turn of the century period, when the U.S. underwent its most dramatic transformations, including the end of slavery, the failure of Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow segregation, mass immigration and new race-based exclusions to citizenship and entry, imperial expansion and the closing of the American frontier, mass industrialization and changing economic conditions, and the women's suffrage movement and reproductive rights debates. How did ordinary people understand this evolving landscape? Did these changes provoke anxiety or stimulate new fantasies about the nation? How did people articulate the idea of an increasingly racially and culturally diverse America? How did artists, writers, and social reformers attempt to sway public opinion? What new genres and institutions were created to help instantiate new visions of the nation? As a graduate student at the University of Virginia, I began to seek answers to these questions. The more I learned about major patterns of immigration in the United States, I realized how very little I knew about Asian immigration and West Coast experiences. My education thus far had privileged European immigration into the eastern United States, epitomized by Lady Liberty welcoming new arrivals to Ellis Island. But this was just one piece of the nation's story. I realized how very much I didn't know about this topic and about this historical period. And this brings me to my next axiom. As you embark on the romance of research, let yourself fall down rabbit holes, like Alice in Wonderland. Explore new facets of your topic, especially in other disciplines adjacent to or well outside of your comfort zone. As students doing women and gender studies work, you have a head start. You're likely already doing interdisciplinary work, connecting feminist theory and social history to literary texts, film, video games, sociological data, psychological studies, and social activism. When I was an undergraduate, I focused almost exclusively on literary texts. But in graduate school, I grew interested in critical theory, history, legislation and court cases, visual culture, critical race theory, and ethnic studies. A legal history class taught me about the role of immigration exclusion laws in court cases in shifting attitudes towards various racial and religious groups. And serving as a teaching assistant for a faculty member in anthropology expanded my understanding of Asian American history and culture. Here, too, I saw how gender intersected with race and class in complex and frequently infuriating ways. For example, the 1875 Page Law excluded Chinese women from immigrating to the United States due to fears of prostitution, which created large bachelor communities of single Chinese men who were in turn prohibited by anti-miscegenation laws from marrying white women. And shortly thereafter that, in 1882, they'd also be prohibited from naturalized citizenship. Yet in the 1922 Cable Act, that stated that an American woman who married an Asian immigrant could lose her U.S. citizenship if she left the country with him. But in 1945, the War Brides Act ensured that foreign women who married U.S. soldiers would be guaranteed automatic citizenship. Learning about this uneven legislative history added crucial dimensions to my readings of fiction. As Lisa Lowe explains in Immigrant Acts from 1996, the immigration of Asians to the United States has been the locus of meanings that are simultaneously legal, political, economic, cultural, and aesthetic. To do justice to the study of minority representations requires one to engage with all of those discourses. When I first reread Little Women, I would never have imagined that my research would take me to these new frontiers, but I'm so glad it did. It enriched my understanding of the period, of the nation, of gender history, of racial formation, and of literature in the United States. When it came time to focus on a dissertation topic, I wanted to study turn-of-the-century minority writers who hadn't already been exhaustively written about, who weren't considered canonical. And so I began reading once popular writers from this period who had fallen out of critical favor. In reading their work, including genre fiction like Oriental romances, paranormal Gothic novels, magazine stories, pseudo-ethnographic essays, memoirs, letters, reports, illustrations, and photographs, I began to find certain patterns. A variety of women writers, especially minority women writers, imagined America in new ways. They relied upon scenes of domesticity, romance, and marriage to show the diversity of the national family. They also spatialized social relations, depicting women claiming city streets, neighborhoods, and public spaces in order to proclaim their representativeness as Americans. And this leads me to my next axiom. The romance of research demands that you trust your instinct, to listen to what your gut tells you is the story that needs telling, or the question that needs answering. In other words, follow your curiosity, be curious, and hang on. At my dissertation defense, my committee felt that with revision, the dissertation could become a book. But I felt sure that I had found two different phenomena that were pulling me in two different directions. Two of the chapters, those that both dealt with romance and family, demanded that I give them more attention. In one, I discussed African-American writer Pauline Hopkins, who wrote a serialized novel that showed that the institution of slavery had created mixed-race, incestuous families. White men fathered children with their slaves, and often their sons did the same, leading to incest. Hopkins showed that the cycle continued in the Jim Crow era, dooming all Americans if they failed to recognize the family ties that already connected Black and white, male and female, Northerners and Southerners. In another chapter, I analyzed Asian American fiction writer Winifred Eaton's stories in which Asian and Asian American women nearly committed incest, also unwittingly, because their white fathers had abandoned mixed-race children who they had conceived while on business in Japan. Both writers depicted incest and miscegenation, that is interracial sex, as related practices. My gut told me that this was the story that I needed to pursue. I needed to know if other minority groups in the United States also showed miscegenation leading to incest. How common was this trope? How did various writers use or adapt the notion of the nation as a mixed-race, incestuous family? Do they all say similar things or very different things? How did this trope affect readers, making them think differently about minorities and mixed-race people in the United States? Did these writers, who most of whom we no longer know as household names, did they nevertheless influence our contemporary culture in profound ways? Although writing a book on the incest miscegenation trope would require much more new research, I knew that that's what I was passionate about. I needed to find answers to those questions. And so I read a lot. I read dozens of works by popular writers of the period, and did indeed find other examples of the miscegenation/incest plot. As I studied these texts, I found important commonalities as well as key differences. And part of what I want to get at here is learning these new areas, learning these new research interests is scary. You put yourself out there to be ignorant of topics. And one of the things that I found most rewarding in working on this book was for each new chapter, I had to learn a whole new body of knowledge. And that meant being humble, going to conferences, meeting with people, and asking them to read my work, to give me feedback, to tell me where I was wrong, to point me in new directions of research. And that process of always being a student, always being curious, always being open, not being afraid to stumble, I think is another really important part of your job as scholars. So this is the cover of the book. It was published last year, as Katie mentioned, by Rutgers University Press. It illustrates how minority voices speak both within and against dominant narratives of the United States. I came to see the figure of the mixed-race incestuous family as a traveling trope, one picked up and modified by different authors from different racial backgrounds who wanted to draw attention to and sympathy for various minority groups. What began with African American history and literature was adapted by Asian American, Mexican American, Native American, and Euro American women writers to draw attention to particular histories of oppression and inequality. Each author made the trope her own until it became a familiar national genre, which I call the racial romance. Beginning with anti-slavery fictions featuring mulattoes, the racial romance grew to include half-castes, mestizos, half-breeds, half-bloods, and other multiracial mongrel identities. The familial imagination thus functioned within the United States as a microcosm of the multiracial character of its citizenry, as it was being transformed from without and within. Doris Sommer describes national allegories as constructing eros and polis upon each other. Within the U.S. context, racial romances highlighted the erotic and political ties connecting the nation's diverse constituencies into a single family. The ongoing obsession with and particular fantasies about race and sexuality in the United States reveal a nation in a state of arrested development, unable to reconcile the mixed-up, mixed-race world as it is with the binary order, white-black, us-them, civilized, barbaric, that the West has touted since the Enlightenment. In a variety of popular fictions published in the U.S. around the turn of the 20th century by authors who shared no ethnic, literary, political, or personal ties, nevertheless, certain conventions keep appearing. Mixed-race protagonists, caught between two cultural worlds, struggle to find their place, and this dilemma is illustrated through their romantic attachments. These mixed-race heroes, and especially heroines, are the product of previous generations of interracial romance or conquest between privileged and mobile white men, slave owners, missionaries, businessmen, sailors, and other fortune seekers, and the non-white women with whom they came into contact. Whereas the relationship of parents of the mulatto or half-caste reflected the historical inequalities between white men and racialized women in that first generation, the romantic attachments of the mixed-race heroine in the present represent an imagined future in which equality might yet be possible. Racial romances make their political claims by illustrating the familial ties that bind people of various races into a single nation. To underscore the familiality of racial difference in these works, miscegenation is repeatedly linked to incest that has already occurred, that threatens to occur, or incestuous eroticism, such as between non-blood relatives who treat each other like siblings. So these are some of the covers of the books I write about. So in Mourning Dove's Western romance Kajuia, the half-breed adopted brother Jim is transformed into a romantic partner for the heroine, who is also a half-breed, blurring the line between endogamy, or incest, and exogamy, meaning marriage outside the family, which could include miscegenation. This happy romantic resolution in the book, which might suggest half-breeds sticking with half-breeds, is complicated by the fact that that coupling is paired with two other marriages on the family ranch. Kajuia's two sisters, who are also half-breeds, marry European immigrant homesteaders, thus insisting that the new national family will be mixed race as well as mixed culture in the U.S. West. In other stories and novels, literal incest signified a secret history of interracial romance, and especially of racialized women's exploitation by white men. So, for example, in Winifred Eaton's short story, A Half-Caste from 1899, a father unwittingly attempts to seduce his long-lost Amerasian daughter when he goes back to Japan after a long absence. In A Father from 1900, a young white man and the lovely half-caste young woman he hopes to wed are dismayed to discover that they share the same father. Similarly, in Pauline Hopkins' novel Of One Blood, from 1903 to 1904, two light-skinned African Americans passing as white fall in love and marry, aided by the husband's best friend, a wealthy white Southerner, who soon plots the murder of the husband and the rape of the wife. The revelation of this treachery is complicated by an even more shocking revelation that all three, the husband, his wife, and his frenemy, are full siblings, the products of generations of miscegenation and incest under slavery and segregation. In all of these fictions, miscegenation and incest are inseparable acts linked by a history of racial and gender oppression. This miscegenation incest scenario also appears in American literature focused on U.S. imperialism with other nations. The Mexican-American writer Maria Cristina Mena deploys the racial romance in short stories illustrating changing social codes in a revolutionary-era Mexico that has been transformed in the past by Spanish colonialism and in the present by U.S. capitalism. In the story Doña Rita's Rivals, a young, aristocratic Mexican man named Jesus Maria is moved by two great passions, his love for a lower-class mixed-race mestiza woman, and the revolutionary politics of Pancho Villa. His domineering and incestuous Mexican Catholic mother breaks off his affair with the mestiza, resulting in the young woman's suicide, and her son then has a hysterical illness and takes to his bed. The mother procures the dead girl's twin sister to minister to her sick son, who grows stronger as the substitute lover becomes an adopted sibling. The adopted sister transforms Jesus Maria's interracial cross-class romance into fraternal, non-sexual, revolutionary fervor. In this Pan-American version of the racial romance, the fraternal erotics of the Mexican Revolution are presented as a healthier alternative to the pathological incest of Spanish colonialism and US-influenced neo-imperialism. Now, sibling eroticism is this related phenomenon, and I see that appearing in Eaton's stories about US imperialism in Japan, with the purpose of articulating not only the US as a mixed race nation, but a mixed cultural nation as well. Thus, in The Heart of Hyacinth from 1903, a male half-caste falls in love with and marries his adopted white sister, while in Miss Lily and Miss Chrysanthemum, the love story of two Japanese girls in Chicago from 1903, the most compelling romance in the story is the homoerotic relationship between half-caste sisters, one raised in the US with her father, the other raised in Japan with her mother, who are reunited in adulthood. In all of these cases, romance provides a model, either a positive or a negative example, of the familial ties binding people of different races in the United States and in its relationships with other nations. All of these plots were written between 1898 and 1916. They feature melodramatic plot twists, surprising revelations, shocking betrayals, madness, and death. They're titillating and sexually provocative with their depictions of forbidden romances and taboo desires. But they're also familiar, even old-fashioned, in their reliance on the generic conventions of romance, Orientalism, the Gothic, the tragic mulatto plot, and the captivity narrative. These are messy, overstuffed plots that merge conventional style and radical politics. They share the central conceit that the nation is like a family, one that is both racially and culturally mixed. In short, racial romances offer a model of the nation as always already multiracial and multicultural. This anti-hegemonic model of the national family vividly refutes typical representations of the U.S. nation as a racially pure, non-incestuous, and unequivocally heterosexual family promoted by popular eugenicists and anti-miscegenation advocates. The fantasy of pure national origins is contradicted by historical realities. Intersecting the racial hierarchy, structuring American life and culture then, is a sexual hierarchy that privileges men and heterosexual romance. The historical inequalities experienced by non-white citizens have in turn led to a host of queer family formations, from the matriarchal black household to the extended immigrant clan to the incestuous interracial family. Judith Butler argues that incest and miscegenation taboos and the marriage laws that prohibit such unions presume the heterosexuality of the family, in turn disguising the conditions of white male privilege and raced female abjection upon which the nation was built. All of these alternative family formations, which nativists and racists have depicted as external threats to the American national family, have in fact been the product of internal power asymmetries. In the book, I focus my analysis on fictional texts written in English for the mass market because these imaginative works capture the fantasies of the population, both their authors and their readers. And they allow for a space of possibility often not realizable in the political realm. Popular fiction does important cultural work, offering imaginative alternatives to current social problems and calling attention to untold histories. Werner Sollers argues that allegorical romance in ethnic fiction may not be realistically convincing, but is the result of a certain aesthetic strategy that's trying to imagine an ideal response, what we could do in the real world, in an ideal world. I'm suggesting that the oft-repeated story of interracial incest, whether embraced, averted, belatedly recognized, or transformed into more conventional romance, can be read as an imagined resolution to U.S. racial and sexual inequalities. Racial romances demanded that readers acknowledge the nation's history of injustice and imagine a more egalitarian future. In these ways, familial fictions help to change social attitudes over time. As ideas gained popularity, they proliferated in mainstream print culture. That which was imaginable in fiction could become possible in fact. To me, these fictions suggested the origins of multiculturalism as a discourse, long before the term was coined in the mid-20th century. And this leads me back to my next axiom in the romance of research. Learn to listen to the archive. Research, like any healthy relationship, requires that you talk, but also listen. To do research well, you need to know what you're trying to say, but you also have to hear what the evidence has to tell you. Or especially when it differs from your hypotheses. When you're in the archive or immersed in your analysis, you must be ready for surprises, for the unexpected. And in this way, doing research is a leap of faith into the unknown in order to learn the new terrain. Be prepared to be wrong. Be prepared to explore. But part of this listening is also learning to listen to your audience, to hear criticism without taking it personally. And again, I think there's an analogy to be made with any long-term relationship. You have to learn to hear what the other person is saying, not get defensive, and then figure out how to make things better. The same is true with research. It's not all about you. It's about the work. You need to get a thick skin to be able to hear what your readers are saying and to work to address their feedback. This is one of the most important lessons I can impart. It's true for research, for other kinds of work, and for relationships with other people. Learn to listen, learn to respond, use feedback to get better. All of this can be overwhelming, confusing, exhausting, but like a romance, it can transform you in ways you never expected. In terms of methodology, my work is thoroughly comparative, focusing on narratives of multiculturalism that travel between various minority literary traditions to become truly national in scope. I believe it is vitally important to recognize large-scale patterns among various works, while also being really attentive to the specific contexts and forms of the texts, of the individual texts within that you're studying. By situating my analysis of individual texts within their specific historical contexts, I seek to identify key moments in the nation's shifting sense of identity. My work aims to create a thick context for understanding racial formation and what Michael Omi and Howard Winant describe as the continuing significance and changing meaning of race. Combined with this attention to the historical, I utilize a variety of theoretical approaches, from psychoanalysis and feminism to queer theory and critical race theory, in order to understand all of the forces that shape, reflect, and redefine national culture, and what the resulting cultural myths say about the people and the zeitgeist that created them. I continue to be interested in seeing how multiculturalism has evolved, been rejected, and yet continually reemerges as a source of both inspiration and frustration for contemporary American artists. The racial romance remains a vital stock in trade for writers interested in exploring the U.S.'s history of inequality and for imagining alternative futures. From Toni Morrison to John Sayles, from Ruth Ozeki to Barack Obama, from Cherie Moraga to Gish Jen, contemporary writers continue to deploy the racial romance as a means to illustrate viscerally the ways that the nation's people are part of a single national family bound by a shared, if long denied, history and united in a common future. So, for example, John Sayles' film Lone Star from 1995 updates this racial romance for the Texas borderlands in the latter half of the 20th century. In it, high school sweethearts Sam Deeds and Pilar Cruz, separated for nearly 2 decades by the community's racism and their parents' disapproval, are reunited only to discover they have the same white father. Sayles' film is an elegiac portrait of the U.S. as a multiracial, multicultural, and incestuous nation shaped by centuries of contact between Anglos, Mexicans and Mexican Americans, African Americans, and American Indians. Sayles relies upon the racial romance to explain U.S. history and imagine new identificatory possibilities. Nearly a century after these women writers I'm talking about, the racial romance continues to be a familiar way to infigure our nation's ambivalent history and illustrate its possible futures. My research thus demonstrates how multiculturalism took shape in national fantasies around changing ideas of race, gender, class, and sexuality, which emerged in the early 20th century. Today, as pundits periodically proclaim that we're in the post-racial era in American history, I think it's all the more important to make sure we understand how identity politics first emerged on the national stage and what metaphors were used to articulate a changing nation. If we grapple with our past, we might better grasp our present and create new possibilities for the future. This has been the story of my romance with research over the last 2 decades. The question I have for all of you is, have you been ensnared in the romance of research? What questions or topics have you fallen in love with? Are you prepared to lose yourself in the archives, to explore new terrain, wherever it may lead you? And what new discoveries will you make which will further transform what we now know about gender, sexuality, and culture? Thank you. And I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Did you find any unique interracial things in your own family history?
You should ask my father. He's the one who's interested in genealogy. I tend to be much more interested in imaginative stories than an actual family, but in a way, yes. One of the things that struck me so much, especially about Alcott's Little Women, and thinking about that, is my own family's history and my own parents who are here. When they got married 40 odd years ago, my mom is Jewish and from New York, and she is the prototypical turn of the century, grandchildren of immigrants, right? Family came over around 1900, to leave the pogroms of Eastern Europe, classic, Jewish immigrant story. My dad's family came over in the 18th century from Germany to Pennsylvania, and under very different conditions. And so my own family history has 2 very common immigrant narratives. Yet when they got married in 1970, it was not an easy thing. And part of that one of the things I also learned in my research is that whiteness is a moving target, right? That what we consider white today, many of those groups were not considered white at different moments in history. The Irish were not white in 1840 and 1850 when they were coming to the US to escape the potato famine. Germans were not quite white in the 1860s when they were coming over. Asian Americans were certainly not white, and they were not the model minority either until the 1960s. And so seeing those, realizing those histories, that whether it's interracial marriage, or what we now would think of as, oh, my parents don't have an interracial marriage. Well, depending on when they got married, it might well have been considered an interracial marriage. So in that way, I think we all have those stories in our family because the meanings of race, the meanings of these categories change so much over time. Sure.
When you talk about the romance of research, how do you feel challenged by the academic job situation? Like, whenever I talk to students about taking up this career, you can't have that conversation without talking about what's happened, and it's getting worse by the minute, and how does that affect what you have to say?
I think about this question all the time because I do work with graduate students as well as undergrads, and I think about advice for really talented undergrads who are thinking, oh, I really love this. They get bitten by the bug, and then what do you say? Or graduate students who have made that choice and are looking what's ahead, how few jobs there are. And for me, part of that answer has been thinking about the relationship between the kinds of thinking and writing that we do as research and how that can be deeply connected to a lot of different kinds of jobs outside. So for graduate students I'm working with, I think a lot and talk a lot about alt-ac careers, right? Working to do digital curation for the Library of Congress, for local museums to develop exhibits online, to think about all the ways that the skills you gain as a researcher, learning how to sort through data and figure out what's a good source, what's a bad source, right? Synthesizing large volumes of information to say, okay, here's a pattern I see. Here's how I make sense of this together. Learning to write clearly and persuasively, right? Because the truth is, once you leave college, everything you write, it will always be persuasive writing. If you're sending an email to someone, you're trying to persuade them to read something, to do something, to think differently. And so that those skills are absolutely crucial in no matter what career. So for graduate students, it's thinking about how to use those deep skills they've developed over a long period of time in a variety of meaningful ways that aren't necessarily the academic research or academic teaching career, the tenure track position, because those are increasingly difficult to get. For undergrads, I think it's really seeing that, reading literature or reading sociology, these are not things you only do in college, but that when you leave, you can directly apply those skills. And I think one of the challenges we have in the humanities isn't learning new job skills. It's being able to articulate to employers the skills that we have and that those skills are the ones they're looking for. When you ask most employers the kind of workers they want, most of them say, I can train them to learn, the industry. I can train them to write about healthcare in particular. I can teach them how to talk about telecommunications, but they don't have the time or the energy to teach them how to write clearly, how to sort information, how to analyze data. And those are the things that you all know how to do. So I think part of it is just being better at selling ourselves in a way, knowing the skills we have and being able to talk about them to a variety of audiences.
You talked about following where the research leads you, and so with your hypotheses, there you have to leave up So what was your favorite hypothesis that was completely blown by your research?
Well, one thing was, I mean, in a way, this project began more with questions than with clear hypotheses. And I think the biggest left turn for me was in writing the dissertation, where I thought the whole project was actually about space. That's what my intention was. I was going to talk about domesticity, public space, private space, city space, and how different minority women engaged with space. That's what I thought I was writing a dissertation on. And then it turned out that half the dissertation really didn't care about space at all, but was all about these weird, totally bizarre, and utterly fascinating relationships. And so that was the question, you know, do you try and wedge this back into the original plan and try and draw out space where I no longer thought it really belonged? Or do you say, I like the left turn better than what I started with, and let's see where that leads?
Yeah, I promise I'm not a plant. So I'm really fascinated by the way that you sort of yoke together miscegenation and incest in your research. And as I was sort of thinking about it, they sort of seemed like, in some ways, they sort of seemed like opposites. So miscegenation is this dilution and this move outwards, and incest is this kind of concentration and inbreeding and moving inwards. And so my question to you is, do you see them functioning in sort of an interchangeable way, or does one kind of serve as a metaphor for one thing or another? Or like, how do you sort of see the relationship between those functioning?
Yeah, well, and in much of, and I had to take out obviously a lot from the book into this, but in a lot of the popular discourse of the time, there is this sense of them as opposites, right? And so people like Walter Ben Michaels has a famous book called Our America about the 1920s, and he's talking about nativist writers like Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote the book on which Birth of a Nation was based, or people like modernist writers like Hemingway. And he shows in those writers from the 20s that all of these authors suggest that you have to choose either miscegenation or incest, and that they all choose incest. Better to be incestuous than to mix with people unlike you. And so that is one thread. But there are also these weird moments where they get conflated. So in like 1845, a sociologist named Hughes has this whole treatise. It's called the Treatise on Sociology, and he has this whole thing where he says miscegenation is like incest because both are monstrous and both are crimes against God and nature. And it's an incredibly convoluted argument to say that they're both the same kind of monstrousness, right? So there are these moments where they're yoked together, but for different political ends. But I think in the moment I'm interested in, all of these authors are playing with that assumption that these are opposite, that one sends you outward to mix with new people and one sends you inward to stay with your own. And in fact, they show what you think might be exotic and foreign and exciting. I'm going to go on a kind of sexual tourism. Inadvertently, you end up right back where you started with your daughter or your sister or whatever, because those family histories have been occluded by these power relationships.
I was going to say, with the world becoming smaller as it is, it seems like we run into a bigger problem with that as we move along.
Yeah, and I think that writers who use it today are talking about new forms of cosmopolitanism with people, multiple migrations and things like that. That's why it's still relevant, because the world does seem to get smaller and smaller. Anyone else?